I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is the part 2 of my August 2016 wrap-up. I will link part 1 below. To start with, throughout the month, I was listening to the audiobook of George Eliot's Middlemarch. I got the idea to do that because I saw the read-along that Rincey Reads was doing. I'll put a link to that video below as well. And I'd always thought that I should read it, frequently called the best novel ever written in the English language, so I felt like it was something that was missing from my education, that I have never read it. But I'm not a huge fan of the huge build-up, small payoff that a lot of 19th century British writing has. So I was hesitant to read it because kept thinking, would I give up? So that's why I went for the audiobook instead. So I was listening to it about an hour every morning when I was walking the dog. And the version that I downloaded was the one that narrated by Marina Bryan, who did a great job. So if you wanted to listen to the audiobook, I would recommend that version. It was a really interesting read. I was more engaged in it than I thought I was going to be. The big setup didn't bother me as much. Maybe that was because I was listening to it rather than reading it, because I do feel like if it was me turning the pages, I might have stopped earlier, whereas if it, in the more passive way of listening to it, I think that made it easier to stick with it even when I was less interested with what was going on. That said, I did find it a lot more interesting and a lot more engaging than I expected. And also interesting from a historical perspective, because so much of it is about the internal lives of these people in their relationships. And with a lot of the married couples and the couples who are courting, a lot of the issues that they have are related to the fact that the people in their society, they were limited in what they could really say to each other, and also in the way that they were raised and their expectations. And it was really interesting to read that, sometimes frustrating, because as a modern reader, you almost want to say, you know, slap them and say, okay, just tell him what you mean, or tell her what's actually going on. But they can't do that because of the expectations and everything. So it was a really interesting portrait of the time, just aside from the literary merit of the whole thing. And it also made me more sympathetic to modern writing that uses that very descriptive, very emotionally descriptive style, which is not something I look for myself, and it's not something I particularly enjoy, but it made me respect that more, because I think I've usually been very dismissive of that, which is more about my taste than it is about objectively how good of writing it was. So I appreciated that kind of opened my mind in that way too. So yeah, I was glad that read-along was happening, because it made me read that, so thank you. Next up, The Steady Running of the Hour by Justin Go. I did a longer sort of ramble about this more than a review, so I'll link that video below and won't say much about it. This was one where I loved about 80% of it. I thought this was written in a really poetic style almost. The formatting was interesting too. It has parallel plot lines. There's a modern plot line that's happening, and then there's a bit with characters who are first in the First World War and then in the 1920s. I really liked the bits that were those historical ones. The motivations behind a couple of the modern characters were really not believable, and that kind of killed a lot of what I really liked about the book. That, not so much that it ruined it, because there was still a lot to like, but yeah, I wasn't thrilled with some of the choices in that. But you can watch the longer video if you care, and if not, you don't have to listen to me talk about it. Another book that I also ranted on in that separate video was Dark Terror by John Wilson, which is a First World War adventure / educational book for sort of middle readers, which does a good job of that. It's about a 15-year-old in Newfoundland who lies about his age to enlist in the First World War, as people did, and who has adventures, and there are some educational bits. It does a good job, and if you're looking for that type of book, you won't be disappointed, but it wasn't spectacular, and I think there are better stories aimed at that age group about the First World War, and that maybe do a better overall job, but that, I mean, you wouldn't be disappointed with it. I wasn't disappointed with it. Speaking of good, just not great, I also read Leigh Bardugo's Grisha Trilogy. Now, I read Six of Crows, which is in the same world, although not really a tie-in, about 6 months ago, and I hadn't read these, so I felt like I should, because I enjoyed that, but I feel like a lot of people read that knowing more about this series. this series is much less my kind of thing. So I mean, when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about it from that perspective. So that's the very subjective. The romantic elements were not my cup of tea, and I really disliked a couple of the main characters when it came to specifically their relationship. So that kind of made me less of a fan of this than I would have been otherwise, because I really liked the world. I liked that it has this sort of pseudo-Russian setting. Well, it kind of drove me crazy that the main female character's last name is Starkov and not Starkova, but I mean, it's not Russia, so I guess that's excusable. But I really liked that, and I really liked the magic system and the way the magic system was interacting with the increasing technology in that world. Especially there's one with the people with wind powers and how they behave on ships and in early air flight, things like that. I thought that was really well done. And I was engaged in the whole story, in the whole series. So even though, especially in the middle book, where I was really irritated with both of the main characters, I still wanted to keep reading it because it was fun to read. And I mean, if you like that kind of teenage romance, then I think these would be even better. Because that wasn't so much my thing, but I really liked the world. And I'm very much looking forward to the sequel to Six of Crows that's coming out later this month. So, good stuff. Another book that I read that I guess you'd say I'm not really the target market for, and I guess I should give some lead up to this. A friend of mine who's a grade 7-8 teacher and I were talking about some of the books that she has in her classroom library, which is books that aren't like on the curriculum but that the kids can take out. And a lot of those fall into the sort of after-school special kind of writing. And she was telling me that the example of disability fiction that she had there was Cynthia Voight's Izzy Willy-Nilly, which was written in the 80s. My sister, I think, read it when she was, that age in the 90s, and she brought it home, and that's why I read it, because it happened to be there. And I was telling her that I really thought there were a lot of problems with that, and that it's really more of a don't drink and drive warning than it is anything that you would really want to call disability related, even though that's what the story is about, because it has not great implications, I think. And so we were talking about, is there anything better? And I said, I don't know, but I found this for $1 on Book Outlet, so I thought I would read it and get back to her on that. So this is Push Girl, which, as the name suggests, is kind of tie-in to the cheesy reality series Push Girls. And it's very much an after-school special. Like, this is for, 12 to 14-year-olds, and it's about, high school drama. But if you're comparing this to that older book in terms of somebody acquiring a disability, because that's what this is about, it's a teenager and she's a dancer and she has a spinal cord injury and then she goes back to school. This is a much better example of that is not a cautionary tale. It's just about something happens to someone, they get on with their life, they continue to have their teenage drama, which, is probably not great writing, and as I said, it's like an after-school special, but it does that well. And the one thing that really made me compare it to, specifically to Izzy Willy-Nilly, is that in that book, there's a scene where the main character is frustrated because she can't stomp out of a room. And it's presented as, well, you can't stomp out of a room in a wheelchair. Full stop. And there's never anything, she doesn't develop better skills or anything later on. Whereas in this one, the girl, is frustrated that she can't stomp out of a room at one point, and a few chapters later, she's learned how to stomp. And she can, stomp down on the casters, turn around, And I thought that was a great example of, ideally, I think, the way this kind of literature should be. I think both in terms of educating kids and in terms of having representation that is not all, depressing and all, here your life is a cautionary tale, which I really think is what a lot of the older books do, and that one that I was talking about in particular. So anyway, yeah, not something I would have read if I hadn't had that discussion with my friend, and if it hadn't been $1, but yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to tell her that this is a better choice in those terms. Then I finished the month off by reading D.B. Jackson's Thieftaker, which was a lot of fun. It's a urban fantasy / mystery detective story slash historical fiction. It's set in Boston in the 1760s. The main character is a thief-taker, which is basically a detective, and he's a conjurer, or as they sometimes call him, a witch. And I really was entertained by this. I didn't know how good it was going to be. I thought, oh, that might be cheesy, but let's see. Because again, this was another book outlet one that cost about $1. And it was great fun. I really liked the magic system, the rules of magic. That was nicely done. The mood, the description of clothing and streets and everything. You could imagine that era. You could imagine Boston. And yeah, I don't know. It's part of a series, and I've picked up a bunch more. Also on book outlet, so they were nice and cheap, although not quite as cheap because they're hardcovers. But I'm definitely looking forward to reading those. They were a lot of fun, and I'm sure it'll get more fun as I assume they're going to go forward in history, and eventually you're going to hit the American Revolution. So I think that'll be fun to read. So, yeah, and that was it for the second half of August.